Hello listeners, I'm Josh and welcome to Dialectic of Violence. If you're one of the people that took the time to like or subscribe after checking out my first video, which was a study of Yuri Prochazka's style, I really appreciate it and hope that you enjoy this video here. If you're new, welcome. I hope I don't bore you to death. It's going to be a busy upload schedule for me this week. Initially, I was going to podcast about what kinds of strikers are likely to have the most success against Alex Pereira. But after this weekend's dramatic result at UFC Saudi Arabia, Adesanya versus Imavov, I thought I'd throw up a little something about the French middleweight, who I've had my eyes on for quite some time, even if I didn't quite predict him to finish Izzy early on the feet. One of the most fascinating things to me personally about mixed martial arts is seeing all the different types of fighting in all fields of the game and looking into where they come from. As such, I'm also going to give a relatively brief historical and technical overview of Savate, or French kickboxing, and then an evaluation of the pros and cons of this style of fighting, and examples of when Imavov uses these techniques to his advantage. Finally, I'm also going to briefly touch on what I think Adesanya should do going forward after this pretty disastrous loss. For those of you who have tuned in on the Yuri Prochazka video, I will just let you know that don't worry, I will be putting down some timestamps so that you can navigate more easily to different parts of this video. And once again, I'm Josh and welcome to Dialectic of Violence. The French variant of kickboxing is known by a number of names. Owing to its origin in the French Mediterranean port city of Marseille, it was initially known as Jeu Marseillais, or the game from Marseille. It's probably a good time to apologize in advance for my butchering of the language, as my French is non-existent, but I can't really avoid it in this video. So for any French speakers or French speaking listeners, je suis désolé. The art was later renamed chausson, or slipper, a reference to the particular manner in which Savate practitioners, or tireurs, kick. Savate itself has a similar etymology, meaning old shoe. Unlike Muay Thai, where most kicks are intended to land with the shin, Savate practitioners kick almost entirely with the soles of their feet, which are typically in a shoe, as the name suggests. The name chausson was typically used to refer to a more sports-like manner of fighting, whereas savate de rue, literally savate of the street, emphasized committed, powerful techniques and typically kept kicks below the groin. Savate was also notable at this time for incorporating open hand slapping and palm strike techniques, as opposed to closed fist punches, as the latter was considered a deadly weapon under French law. As anyone though that has seen Bas Rutten fight already knows, a well-placed palm strike is more than capable of incapacitating an opponent, regardless of what the 17th or rather 18th century French court system seemed to think. As creative as the French may have been as a people, as is evidenced by their art and culture throughout the centuries, savate was not invented out of whole cloth by rowdy sailors. In fact, these sailors who travelled and got into bar fights in ports from the Caribbean to the Far East incorporated techniques that they had seen all over the globe. In visits to the French Caribbean, Brazil, and Madagascar, they came into contact with a number of highly athletic styles such as capoeira and its many related arts throughout the African and black diaspora communities of the Atlantic and beyond. And in the Far East, they presumably also came into contact with a number of kick-heavy styles from places as far afield as the Malay Archipelago, to China, and to Vietnam. Other innovations were made closer to home, as evidenced by the name of one technique, the chasse italien, or Italian kick. The two men who are considered the fathers of the more modern regulated form of savate are Michel Cassot and Charles Lecourt. Cassot was the first to attempt to both clean up and systematize savate around 1820, opening the first salle, which is a term for a savate dojo basically, in 1825. Cassot banned certain techniques of savate de rue, including headbutting, eye gouging, and grappling. It is worth taking into consideration the tendency towards codification of martial arts that was taking place at this period in both Britain and France. Cassot opened his salle a decade after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, where French attempts to exert dominance over continental Europe had faltered, but where the example of the French Revolution had severely undermined the feudal systems that desperately clung on, even in territories that they hadn't occupied, such as Britain. This is not a European history podcast, so I'm going to refrain from going into too much detail about that process, but suffice to say that the modern states in Europe were moving towards a less and less anarchic internal structure. This included limiting the ability of many citizens to carry weapons such as swords, leading to a renewed interest in unarmed combat systems. Across the Channel in Britain, while the Marquess of Queensberry rules would not be drafted until 1867, other rule systems were being introduced to boxing to limit deaths and disfigurement, including the Broughton rules, which were introduced way back in 1743 and included counting out a fighter if they were unable to get up, although back then they allowed for 30 seconds, not 10 like in modern boxing. I consider it very likely that the kicking element of Savate was maintained at least in part to both differentiate the French form from British-style boxing, as, the British considered kicking unmanly, as well as the kicks helped to counter some of the forward movement of British-style boxing when used correctly. How they would counter British-style boxing, I'll look over when I get to the technical part of this episode. On both sides of the channel, this renewed interest in unarmed martial arts was also at least in part likely a result of the changing social conditions of the Industrial Revolution, which began in Northwest Europe. Unlike the feudal era, where aristocrats would almost universally live in feudal estates with men-at-arms to protect them, elites living in European metropolises, such as Paris and London, were in close contact with poverty-stricken industrial workers. Likely, many of these wealthier members of society sought the feeling of safety and confidence that comes with the knowledge of a martial art. Among Paris's bourgeoisie were a number of students of Michel Cassou. One of these gentlemen was Charles Lecour, Cassou's best student. Charles Lecour would fundamentally transform the art of Savate after familiarizing himself with British boxing. In 1838, Lecour witnessed a boxing match between Owen Swift and Jack Adams. Swift was a notoriously dangerous pugilist despite weighing only 57 kilograms or 130 pounds, and would by the end of his career be responsible for the passing of 3 of his opponents, including Brighton Bill, who would that same year lose his life after an 85-round contest. Yes, you heard that correctly. Owen Swift's subsequent manslaughter conviction would lead to the adoption of the London prize ring rules. Lecour took part in a friendly sparring match with Swift, where despite being able to parry some of Swift's punches at distance, he was unable to punch himself due to the limitations of his style, and as such was unable to consistently prevent Swift from getting in his face and infighting him. Lecour would subsequently train boxing for some time, incorporating many of its techniques, particularly with regards to straight punching combinations, into Savate. These additions paid dividends. Lecour's work was continued by one of his own students, Joseph Chalamont, who utilized some clinch work in his style and also conceptualized some stick fighting techniques, a fashionable tendency at this time in European martial arts, as a distinguished gentleman would often carry a cane regardless of mobility, and therefore it was useful as an improvised weapon. Joseph Chalamont's son Charles would show how far the French martial art had come. In an 1899 contest against English boxer Jerry Driscoll, he finished him in the 8th round with a fouette médian, I'm sure I mispronounced that, or round kick with the top of the foot. Although the Englishman would claim the kick landed on the groin, French observers claimed it was to the stomach. Given the vintage of this bout and the nationalistic undertones, it is doubtful that we will ever know the truth. The younger Chalamont student, Count Pierre Barozzi, 11-time Savate champion of France and her colonies, would codify the modern rules and establish a governing body, the Comité National de Boxe Français. The sport would also feature in the 1924 Paris Olympics as a demonstration sport, completing its metamorphosis from the fighting style of choice for drunken sailors to a respected sport and martial art. Today, the official worldwide governing body for the sport is the International Savate Federation. The typical stance of a tireur is bladed as opposed to square, and the foot distance is somewhere between a boxer and a practitioner of traditional East Asian martial arts like Taekwondo and Karate. This allows for both linear and lateral movement to be achieved with relative ease at the expense of specialization. The wider foot position in a boxer largely limits punching techniques to 1-2s, uppercuts, long left hooks similar to a Soviet boxer, and step and overhands to an opponent fleeing in the direction of the dominant hand. Where it sort of isn't really the most effective is things like short chopping hooks, or weaving under punches and throwing off of weaves and so on. In terms of kicks, the Savate stance isn't capable of producing the sheer rotational force of the more dramatic Taekwondo techniques, nor the hacking power of Muay Thai round kicks, but does lead itself to precision and dexterity with the front foot especially. Tireurs tend to have a very active lead leg kicking game, and in contexts such as MMA where shoes aren't worn, They often dig their toes in between ribs or into the stomach to maximize penetration. They are also able to lean forward to torque into powerful kicks with the rear foot, as well as having a stable platform to throw teep or push kicks. The use of the foot for impact certainly has some pros and cons, although the cons are largely due to the lack of shoes in an MMA context. Of course, it is much easier to break bones in the foot than to break the shin, making elbow checks a real pain for terriers, but it also gives some extra range to kicks which can take some opponents by surprise. Of all the kick-heavy martial arts, Savate is the one which most heavily emphasizes the stomp to the knee, or chassé bas. This technique, which is famously been seen used by UFC greats such as John Jones and Robert Whittaker, is extremely effective at stopping and attracts opponents attempting to close distance and throw punches, as for instance a British-style boxer would. There's where we pull it back to how they have structured the style partially to counter British boxing. It's also particularly useful as a weapon in open stance matchups because it allows an orthodox fighter to stomp the front knee of a southpaw or vice versa, which can come in very handy in open stance matchups where it might otherwise be difficult, especially for an orthodox fighter, to consistently land with attritional weapons such as the jab. So, it's probably about time we start talking about Nassourdine Imavov, right? Nassourdine Abdulazimovich Imavov was born into a family of the Kumyk ethnic group, a Turkic people living in Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ossetia. Imavov himself was born in the Dagestani town of Khasavyurt in 1995. At the age of 9, he moved in with his family to the French town of Chalon-sur-Provence, not too far from Marseille. As a youth, he started boxing and afterwards discovered MMA, moving to Paris with his older brother Daguerre, where they joined the MMA factory and came under the tutelage of Fernand Lopez. In the European regional scene, Imavov put together a record of 8-2. He debuted in the UFC in October 2020, where he won by unanimous decision against Jordan Williams. In his next fight, he lost a split decision against Phil Hawes. Whilst this loss hasn't aged very well, as Hawes has gone on to lose all of his durability, it's worth noting that Imavov was at this point still very green, and that purely in terms of skills, Hawes is actually quite good. He simply doesn't have the chin anymore to hang with decent UFC middleweights. After the loss to Hawes, Imavov would finish Ian Heinisch and Edmund Shabazian, both by TKO, and then defeated Joaquin Buckley by unanimous decision, a win that has since aged very well. Imavov did slow down late in the Buckley fight, raising some concerns over his gas tank. These concerns were vindicated in his next fight, where he was outpaced by Sean Strickland and lost by unanimous decision. In his next fight after that, Imavov took on Chris Curtis, where he was dominating the fight until it was ruled a no contest in round 2 as a result of an accidental clash of heads, which rendered Curtis unable to continue. Imavov has since gone on a 4-fight win streak, defeating Roman Dolidze by decision despite a point deduction, getting a late if somewhat controversial TKO against Jared Cannonier, then turned back a surging Brendan Allen, snapping his 7-fight win streak, and most recently a second-round TKO win over former champion and divisional great Israel Adesanya. It's worth noting that after the loss to Strickland, Imavov has since left MMA Factory and is now trained by Nicholas Ott. Ott used to train under Lopez also and is predominantly a striking coach. Whilst Imavov's base is still the Savate-inspired striking style that's reflected in both himself and another Lopez student, the heavyweight contender Cyril Gane, Imavov has become much more aggressive and sharp since leaving the MMA Factory. In his win against Israel Adesanya, Imavov blasted the last style bender with a quick right hand whilst Adesanya was switching stances before connecting with a big left hand as Adesanya was against the fence. For any listeners that want to see the strengths of Savate in action in MMA, I strongly recommend watching Imavov's fight with Chris Curtis. Curtis is a savvy striker, utilising a kind of cloistered southpaw Philly shell-esque stance and using catch and pitch boxing combinations to counter aggressive opponents. Imavov was able to use constant body kicks and stomps to Curtis's front knee to chip away at his stance, and using lateral movement to draw Curtis out of position before punishing him with stinging 1-2s. I think this style could be very interesting against Dricus du Plessis if the South African should find himself victorious in his rematch against Sean Strickland this weekend. While Strickland might be a difficult fight still for Imavov, if the Dagestan-born Frenchman has made improvements to his gas tank and is able to maintain his more aggressive recent form, he stands a good chance of taking revenge on the American. Where I see Imavov struggling in this current top 4 in the post-Whittaker, post-Adesanya era is with Chimaev. If Imavov doesn't manage to improve his cardio, or if his cardio hasn't already improved, we haven't really seen him gone crazy late at a really high pace, he may be unable to take full advantage of Chimaev's tendency to slow down after the first round and a half. That's assuming he even gets out of the first, where Chimaev's combination of technique and sheer horsepower in the wrestling department may result in an early finish for the Chechen. So where to from here for Israel Adesanya? It seems very likely that Adesanya is done competing for the belt at middleweight. Some have floated the idea of going up to light heavyweight for a trilogy bout with Poatan, but I think considering Adesanya's struggles lately and Poatan's ceaseless triumphs up at 205, this is very unlikely. Sure, they're 1-1, but the second fight was essentially one-way traffic until the knockout, which I consider kind of fluky, and made possible only by Pereira draining himself so severely to make the 185-pound weight limit. In terms of other light heavyweight contenders, it's very dangerous for Adesanya. Whilst I don't think it's impossible that he wins against, say, Jamal Hill, or maybe even manages to get the right shot off on Yuri Prochazka, even though, frankly, I think Yuri beats him with sustained aggression, Ankalaev, Rakic, Blachowicz, and Poatan are all really difficult matchups for Adesanya. If Adesanya's mate too, Carlos Olberg defeats Blachowicz in their scheduled bout, then a move up for Adesanya seems even less likely. Frankly, I think Adesanya should retire. He's had a long career, seems to have lost focus and drive, and has made plenty of money and seemingly invested it well. But if he does insist on continuing, then I think that the only fight that really would have any commercial or fan interest is a rematch with Paulo Costa. It would likely be pretty fun. Costa's only real boring fight has been his Strickland one. It's certainly winnable for Adesanya, obviously. He won the first time, and Costa hasn't exactly looked like a world beater since, and would lend itself to the kinds of media build-ups that helped turn Israel Adesanya into a star in his prime. It's also pretty likely that Costa would take that fight, as it still would be significantly up in the rankings, and it would give him an opportunity to avenge the frankly humiliating loss when they fought whilst Adesanya was the champion. So for all of you that are still listening, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to my thoughts on the subjects. The next video that'll be up will be up in a couple of days, and that is going to be the first installment of a project that I have tentatively named Dr. Fistenstein's Laboratory. The premise of that is to get a target fighter, which in the first installment is going to be Alex Pereira, and trying to build someone that is designed purely for beating them. Now, to make it a little bit more interesting for Pereira, because he's such a striking specialist, rather than just go, okay, here's a wrestler, I am going to instead try to figure out what the best kind of striker would be to defeat Alex Pereira, not just to get a quick KO, but to actually dismantle him over a course of a 25-minute fight. So hopefully, those of you who are real technique nerds especially, tune in for that one. It's going to be very dense. I've had to do a lot of tape study, but it should be really valuable, and I'm really looking forward to getting that up and being able to share it with you folks. So for those of you that have listened so far, thank you so much again. And if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment. I really don't like sort of having to ask that. It feels kind of a little pathetic, but you know, it helps to grow the channel, and hopefully once this gets big enough, we can have a little bit of community and maybe we can monetize it. That would be absolutely amazing to make this little passion project also help out with some bills would be fantastic. Anyways, folks, again, it's Josh here from Dialectic of Violence. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful week.